Which war did you serve?
Vietnam era veteran,
What's your branch of service?
U.S. Coast Guard,
What was your highest rank achieved?
E3, Seaman First Class.
And in what general locations did you serve?
I served in Mobile, Alabama on the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Sebago, and I served in Groton, Connecticut at the U.S. Coast Guard Institute.
What year did you enlist in the Coast Guard?
I enlisted in October of 1960.
Where were you living at the time?
I was living with my parents in Wethersfield.
Why did you join the Coast Guard?
I've been interested in boats ever since I was a kid, and mostly small boats. And then when I saw these advertisements on the TV of the 83-footers crashing through the surf, I says, that's for me.
Tell me about your first days of service, like when you went to basic training and everything like that.
Well, I remember we took a train to Philadelphia and then took another train to Cape May, and we arrived late in the afternoon. It was obviously October, kind of cold, and they sent a bus out after us, and the bus wasn't big enough to pick up all of us at once, so they lined us up, and we had to march through this town of Cape May until the bus had gone back to the base and unloaded and come back for more people.
And how was basic training?
Well, ironically enough, we got to bed late because of a lot of different things they did, but, that's one of the few nights in the service where I think I really got a night's rest.
Do you remember your instructors? Anything memorable about them?
Yes, I do. They were the average drill instructor, I guess. Most of them were E6s and a few were E7s. And they, generally speaking, they did their job. And I can't say it was a bad experience.
Was there anything especially stressful or that you remember that was more memorable about your basic training?
No, not really. I had two older brothers. One had been in the Marines and one had been in the Air Force, so I pretty much knew what I was getting into when I joined.
Okay. After boot camp, where did you end up?
Well, ironically enough, coming from the Connecticut area, I guess Connecticut, I believe, was the 3rd Coast Guard district. I'm not clear on that, but I put in for the 3rd Coast Guard district as my second choice, figuring that they wouldn't give me my first choice, which was Mobile, Alabama. Well, to make a long story short, where did I wind up but Mobile, Alabama?
Why did you choose Mobile, Alabama over?
I just figured they wouldn't give me my first choice because it's just the way life goes sometimes, so I put down the 3rd Coast Guard district as my second choice, figuring that I would probably get that one, opposed to the first choice.
What were your first impressions when you arrived in Alabama?
Well, back in the early 60s, Alabama, Mobile especially, was in the heart of the South. And at that time, it was heavily segregated. And I had experienced that segregation at a time before that when I was younger, because I had an aunt who lived in Washington, D.C., and we went down to visit her when we were young. And obviously, Washington, D.C. was very heavily segregated then. And so I wasn't really surprised. Didn't surprise me.
How was the station there in Alabama? Your unit?
Well, obviously we were on a ship, and quarters were tight, and the lower you are in the pecking order, if I can use that term, the living conditions were tighter, but it was something you got used to.
What was a typical day like for you in your unit?
Well, I would get up in the morning, obviously, and we'd have chow, and then we'd have what we call quarters. We'd assemble on the fantail by divisions, and we were given the orders of the day. Obviously, we'd have the salute to the flag at 8 o'clock, and I believe it was 8 bells. And then we were pretty much spent the rest of the day just going around the deck of the ship doing maintenance when we were in port.
Did you ever go out of port?
Oh yes, we were assigned to the Gulf of Mexico in a specific area, and it was referred to as the Campeche Patrol. And our job, basically at that time, was strictly search and rescue, and we did what they call ORI, which was oil rig inspection, because there was a lot of oil rigs down there, and that's what we did. We when we would go on a patrol, we'd be out for 17 days at a time because our ship was big enough to make our own fresh water. So we'd be out for 17 days at a time, and we'd basically be there because there was a lot of shrimp boats down there and fishing vessels, and that's what we were there for, to render aid or assistance to them if they needed it.
Any memorable times to aiding assistance? Or?
Well, the only thing that I do remember that sticks off the top of my head was we were on a weekend. We had what we call weekend routine, and we had anchored the ship out at some point. You couldn't see land where we were, if I remember. And we went to raise up the anchor, and the device used to haul the anchor up caught on fire. So obviously, any fire aboard ship under those conditions is very serious. But we were able to put it out in a very timely manner, and we just moved on.
Sounds kind of stressful.
Yes, it was. Yeah, and there was another instance that was kind of interesting. Being a deck hand and a inexperienced deckhand, if I want to put it that way, each of us got a turn to do what we call a turn in the ship lock, the anchor chain locker. And what we had to do was, when the anchor was being hauled in, it was our job to get out to this little compartment and manipulate the anchor chain so that it didn't bunch up in any one particular area of the locker, so then there would be room to haul up the whole anchor chain.
While you were down there, how did you stay in touch with your family?
Mostly with letters back and forth, and then there was a place down there I think that was some kind of a run by some kind of a Catholic organization or religious organization, and they had rooms and other facilities available for people who want to read or watch TV or whatever. And I used to call my parents once in a while from there and had the charges reversed, so I would pay for the call.
Besides the ship that you were on, there was a home port, correct?
Correct.
What was it, like a big home port? Can you describe the port that you were in?
Well, Mobile was a pretty big city, and I didn't have a car or anything, so most of the getting around I did was just walking. So as far as the size of it, it's hard for me to describe because I didn't go very far away from the ship because I wasn't really mobile.
So when you had libo time, if you had libo time, I'm assuming, yes.
Yes, we had, when we were in port, we had what they called, let me see, I think it was 2/3. You were off 2 nights and on 1 night. You had a duty 1 night and off 2 nights. So that was pretty much it. Some nights some of us never even went ashore. We just stayed aboard and just chilled out.
How did people entertain themselves, whether you were in port on your libo or while you were out in the Gulf?
Well, in port, it was kind of tough for a guy like me because I was only 18 and the age of majority, I guess what you call it, was 21. So you couldn't go into a bar or anywhere like that. So it was pretty limited. And then, of course, when you're out at sea, you pretty much, unless you are what they call a day worker, where you have a regular job that you did every day, that was something that had to be done whether you were in port or not, you would stand watches. And if you were in that particular circumstance, you would be on for a certain period of time and off for a certain period of time if you were a watch stander. And I did both.
Did you ever go on leave?
Not while I was in Alabama, no, because I didn't really know how long I was going to stay there, and being as how I was from Connecticut, it just didn't seem anything that I really was interested to do at the time.
So after Mobile, Alabama, where did you go?
Well, it's a funny kind of a deal. I had a friend who was also lived in the same space that I did, and he worked in the ship's office. And he came down to me one day and he told me that I had orders. And I says, oh, I says, to where? He says, Groton, Connecticut. And he says, it's a very unusual circumstance. He says, we usually get notice from the district office, which is in New Orleans, to send one individual, and just by rank, they would identify somebody by rank, and then they would pick out somebody. But in this particular case, the directive came down right from the district office in Mobile with my name on them. A district office in New Orleans with my name on them. And so there was no doubt as who was to go. It was me. So, of course, I was kind of happy about that because I figured, well, here's a chance to go on leave and at the expense of the government. So that's exactly what I did.
Did you ever find out exactly why you were selected from the district office?
No, I never asked. I never found out. I was just happy to be going.
When you got to Groton, Connecticut, what unit were you assigned to?
I was assigned to, physically, I was, the area where I was assigned to was a part of Groton called Avery Point. And in Avery Point, or on Avery Point, there was a unit called the U.S. Coast Guard Training Facility of some type or other, where after a person left boot camp, if he was eligible for a school, more than likely the school was there on the grounds at Avery Point. But it so happens that my unit was a unit within the grounds of the Avery Point training area called the U.S. Coast Guard Institute. And the training station had its own CO, which was a four-striper, a full captain. And my unit actually was a small unit. And our CO also was a four-stripe, or a colonel, or a captain, whatever you want to call it.
What were your responsibilities when you came to Groton, Connecticut?
Well, basically, my first duties were basically maintenance, because I was, again, a non-rated enlisted man. And that was pretty much it when I first got there.
What type of maintenance were you doing?
Oh, it could be anything, painting, cleaning, that type of thing. That was about it.
Did you happen to go on any special duties?
Not while I was there, no.
Like color guard or anything?
No, not really, because we weren't that kind of a unit. There was no ceremonies involved. We didn't stand any kind of inspections. We weren't told to go anywhere because, ironically enough, most of the men, if I can use the term enlisted men, that were there were all E7s and above, which was pretty high-ranking enlisted men. As a matter of fact, the high-ranking enlisted men outnumbered the white hats, which we refer to the low-ranking enlisted men, were maybe 5-1. That was unusual that there was so many high-ranking enlisted men there.
So with the rank structure the way it was, who was your direct NCO or supervisor?
My first, my NCO, my first NCO was a first-class bosun mate. Because it was a maintenance job, he was in charge of that type of work.
Can you elaborate on your NCO? Was he good?
Well, he was a first-class bosun mate. Like I said, he was an older gentleman. He had white hair, and he had, I couldn't tell you the number of hash marks, but he had quite a few. So he'd been in the service for quite a while. And as a matter of fact, one time I saw him in his dress uniform, and his all his rankings and his, we call them hash marks, obviously, were all gold. So that meant that he was a special recognition type of a gentleman.
since you were in Groton, Connecticut, did you ever leave the station and go see your family, like on the weekends and stuff like that?
Actually, that's kind of a funny question that you asked, because we in that particular function we had every night and every weekend liberty. We there never stood duty. We always had, because there was no duty to stand. We were our own separate unit. It was like a 40-hour-a-week job. We would, the end of the day, we would go. The single guys would go back to the barracks and do whatever you had to do. Go to chow, and then maybe we'd go off the base for a couple hours here and there to New London. And that was pretty much it.
Was there any humorous or unusual events with your peers?
Gee, that's hard to say. Not really, because there was so few of us, white hats I'm talking about, because the high-ranking enlisted people were all mostly married men who would leave the base at the end of the day, and had no interaction with them until the next morning.
I think you mentioned you. Did you mention that you did a flag ceremony or something like that?
No, I don't recall that. The only thing that, if you want to use it in that function, was when I was in boot camp. John Kennedy had been elected president, and we, at the time, the company that I was in was what we would refer to as a senior company. In other words, we could do the march, we could do the drills, and so we were selected. There was about 400 of us were selected to go to Washington, D.C. for his inaugural parade.
How was that experience?
It was a funny experience, and it was for a person like me who hadn't really been involved in the military too much. It was a bit of a hardship, if you want. I could use that term, but when you stop and think about the morning of the parade, we got up and the passenger cars were still cold, and they led us into some other, I guess you'd call them dining cars, where they fed us a meal. And of course, the dining cars were cold, but the meal was hot. And then we assembled outside afterwards, and we were transported to the assembly area, where we stood around for about, I'm going to say maybe 2 or 3 or maybe 4 hours, waiting for our unit to step off. And it was bitterly cold. And even though we had our winter uniforms on, it was quite an experience. And then, of course, when we finally marched off, the streets in Washington, D.C. were not plowed, because they're not equipped for that at that time. And the only street that was actually clean was Pennsylvania Avenue. But after we stepped off of Pennsylvania Avenue, we were back right on the unplowed ground, and it was like walking in the sand with shoes on. And that was the end of that.
Did you meet anybody that was important?
No, not really. We pretty much, assembled by ourselves. There was about 400 Coast Guard men there, and the only ones that we kind of stuck around with were our own shipmates from our own recruit company.
So we'll go back to when you were in Groton, Connecticut. Was there any other duties that you were assigned to while you were there?
Beyond the maintenance?
Yes.
Okay. Well, after I'd been there for about a year, there was an opening in the administration for a clerk. So I guess somewhere along the line they asked me, I think they knew how to type, or I had mentioned it to somebody. And so they put me up into the administrative end of the whole thing, and that's where I spent the rest of my enlistment, which was about 2 years. And it was a very enjoyable job. I enjoyed it very much.
What was it like working with your peers and your senior enlisted?
Well, ironically enough, of course, most of my experiences with upper enlisted men, were kind of adversarial, if I can use that word, because you were a recruit at the time, or you were just out of boot camp at the time, but that in that unit there, even from the day I went there, even in maintenance, they were all they were wonderful people, and I think it has to do with when you, especially if you've been aboard ship, they seem to treat you different than if you've never been on ship, because it's a different experience being on a shipboard than it is being on shore duty. The military courtesy is different, and it's a harder life being on a ship. And I guess if you get through it, I guess you gain a certain amount of respect, no matter who you are.
What were your officers like while you were there?
Our officers were they were about 50-50 warrant officers, which were enlisted men who gained the rank of a full commissioned officer, and they came up from the bottom, and then there was academy men. But as far as the big jobs were concerned, they were all held by academy men, and the lower ranking, if I can use that term, the lower ranking commissioned officers were the ones that got obviously the less cushiony jobs, but they were still a lot better than being an enlisted man.
How were your officers in particular, the ones that were appointed above you?
They were all very well, very nice. They were very nice people. I remember we had a Lieutenant JG, I believe, who was, I'm not sure where he was from, but he was an exceptionally nice gentleman. As a matter of fact, he was like a buddy almost, and that's pretty amazing when you think of what the difference is supposed to be between the enlisted and the officer corps. And he just kind of stood out. He was an academy man, but he really wasn't interested in staying any longer than he had to.
Where were you when your service ended?
I was still there in Groton at Avery Point, and it was pretty much uneventful because I was living on the base because I was single, and it just came to an abrupt halt one day, and that was the end of it.
Can you describe that day where you were discharged?
It was so long ago, it's hard to describe. I mean, the enlistment was good because I learned a lot in the military. Basically, I learned the difference between having an education and not having an education. And I was determined that when I got out of the military, I was going to make something of myself because my prior career wasn't that stellar, if I can use that term, And so I grew up a lot.
What was your homecoming like when you were?
It was fairly muted because being as how we had every night and every weekend of liberty, I would come home on the weekends. So again, like I mentioned before, it was a regular 40-hour-a-week job, and Friday nights we would go off the base, and somehow or other I'd find my way back to Hartford, which was only a half an hour away, or 3/4 of an hour.
What did you do after you were discharged?
Well, I went around looking for a job here, there, and everywhere, and I had a friend who was a neighbor, actually, of my parents, and he recommended that I go to this one particular place and apply for a job. He says it's a good place to work, and he said there's plenty of chances for advancement, and he says even if you have to take an entry-level job, he says take it and get your foot in the door, and things will work out for you. And he was right, because that's exactly what I did, and I wound up in an administrative position at the end of 38 years.
Did you stay in touch with anyone that you served with?
Yes, I did. Okay, his name was Marty, and he was from Springfield, and we were pretty tight when he left. He left a month before me, and ever since then till now, we kept in contact on occasion. I'd visit him a few times, and he would come down and visit me. And after a while, it sort of gravitated to calls on the telephone. He would call me, I'd call him, and we'd exchange a lot of different things. He was a fisherman. He loved to fish, and and of course, I was into cars, antique cars, and a lot of other different things. And but there was something there, And he had come from a lifeboat station up in Maine to Groton, and I guess there was a lot of parallels in our lifestyles or whatever. And that was pretty much it. And then he died in December, and that was
Must have been hard for
it
you.
was hard for me.
Did your time in the service affect your life in general? Your experiences, how you lived your life?
Yeah, I think the part of living aboard ship was the most thing that affected my life more so than anything is the fact that I suppose if you're going to go over to my house right now, it wouldn't look very neat, but I because you have such a small space on a ship that's actually your living space. I That's pretty much the way I live my life now. I try to keep things neat and orderly a good part of the time, maybe somewhat a little bit too much, but it has to come from the being aboard ship.
Is there anything else you'd like to add that hasn't been covered in this interview?
No, I don't think so. I think that pretty much covers it. There is one thing I did that going back to being aboard ship now that I remember that was kind of impressed me as a member of the military at the time was when we were in port. Ships from foreign nations. Of course, Mobile, you have to remember, was a pretty good size seaport, and there was a lot of ships from foreign nations with, cargo ships that would come in and go by. And one thing they used to do was they would dip their flags when they went by our vessel, and I that made me kind of proud to see that they were, honoring our service. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the military discipline aboard ship is so much different than it is on shore. And if you've never been on a warship of any kind, you would see the difference. Courtesy and everything is so much different on a ship.
Well, I'd like to thank you for your service and also for taking the time to be interviewed today.
Well, thank you.